The black Southern cook of the 1940s could turn almost nothing into supper. A handful of neck bones, a cup of rice, a little fatback, and the whole table ate. These dishes were never written down. They lived in the hands of our grandmothers, and they fed families through sharecropping, through the Great Migration, through every lean winter the South ever threw at them. Number 20 on this list could stretch one smoked hawk across a week of dinners. Number 13 cost less than a streetcar ticket and still sent children to school full. And number 6 on this list once held an entire Sunday together. Yet most of these suppers are gone now, pushed out by cheap takeout, by busy schedules, by a quiet shame that called them poor food. So hit subscribe and pull up a chair, because here are 25 poor man's dinners that vanished from Black American kitchens. Number 25, neck bones and rice. This was the dish that proved a family could eat well on the scraps the butcher almost threw away. Pork neck bones were the bones left after the good cuts were sold off, sold cheap because there was barely a bite of meat clinging to them. But black Southern cooks knew the secret was the long simmer. They covered those bones in water, dropped in an onion and a little garlic, and let the pot go for 2 or 3 hours until the meat fell off and the broth turned dark and rich. Then they cooked the rice right in that stock, so every grain soaked up the flavor of the bone. What looked like nothing on the cutting board became a steaming bowl that filled a grown man up after a day in the field. The trick was patience, not money, tender meat, savory rice, and a broth worth keeping. A whole supper out of what others called waste. Number 24, fried bologna. Long before it became a punchline, this was an honest meal that kept many families going. During the Depression, bologna was often the only meat a household could afford, and it was frequently the only meat on hand. Cooks would slice it thick, cut little slits around the edge so it would not dome up in the pan, and fry it in a hot skillet until the edges curled and browned. That crisp ring around the outside was the whole reward. Pressed between 2 slices of light bread with a smear of mustard, it became a sandwich that a child could carry to school or a worker could fold into a lunch pail. Sometimes it went over rice with a little gravy made from the drippings. Cheap, fast, and filling, it stretched a few cents into a real plate of food, a humble meal that asked for nothing and gave back plenty. Number 23, hot water cornbread. When other supplies ran out, this was the meal that stood between a family and an empty stomach. The recipe could not be simpler. Cornmeal, a little salt, a spoon of fat, and boiling water stirred in until it formed a soft dough. The cook patted it into small cakes by hand and dropped them into a skillet of sizzling grease, where they fried up crisp and golden on the outside and tender in the middle. Made with only cornmeal, water, and salt, it was the emergency supper when the cupboard was nearly bare. It went alongside a pot of greens to sop up the potlikker, or it stood alone with a slice of onion when there was nothing else. Quick, simple, and filling, it carried families through the leanest stretch of the Great Depression. A few cents a meal turned into bread that ate like a meal. Number 22, smothered potatoes and onions. If there were potatoes in the bin and an onion on the counter, supper was already settled. Smothering was one of the great techniques of the Southern kitchen, a slow braise that turned the plain ingredients into something soft and savory. The cook sliced potatoes and onions thin, laid them in a heavy skillet with a spoon of bacon grease, and let them cook down low and slow with the lid on. The steam trapped under that lid did the work, melting the onions into the potatoes until the whole thing went tender and sweet. Toward the end, the lid came off so the bottom layer could brown and form that prized golden crust against the iron, A little salt, a little black pepper, and maybe a splash of water to keep it from sticking was all it took. Served with a piece of cornbread, it made a full plate without a scrap of meat. Pure comfort built from two of the cheapest things in the house. Number 21, liver and onions. Organ meat was given away nearly free, and black cooks turned it into a supper rich enough to feed a working man. When hogs were butchered, the liver was among the parts handed off rather than kept, which made it one of the cheapest sources of protein in the store. Cooks dredged the slices in seasoned flour, then laid them in a hot skillet just long enough to brown, because liver turns tough the moment it overcooks. The real magic was the onions. A great pile of them went soft and sweet in the same pan, soaking up the drippings, then got spooned over the top with a thin gravy made from the browned bits. The sweetness of the onion balanced the deep iron flavor of the meat. Served over rice or with a slab of cornbread, it stretched a few pennies of organ meat into a hearty plate, cheap, nourishing, and gone too soon from most kitchens. Number 20, smoked ham, hock, and beans. This was the dish that could stretch one smoked hock across a whole week of dinners. The ham hock was the joint above the pig's foot, a knuckle of skin, fat, and a little dark meat clinging to the bone, and it was sold for next to nothing. But country cooks knew how to make a little meat go a long way. A single smoked hock dropped into a pot of dry butter beans or pinto beans would flavor the entire pot, its smoke and salt seeping into every bean over hours of low simmering. Monday, it was beans and rice. Tuesday, the same pot, reheated and thicker. By midweek, the cook would pull the meat off the bone and shred it back in, and the bone itself kept giving flavor until it was bare. One cheap joint, a bag of dried beans, and a heavy pot turned into supper night after night. A whole week of dinners from a single bone. Number 19, salmon croquettes. Few things smelled more like a black household waking up than a can of salmon hitting a hot skillet. The dish began with a single tall can of pink salmon, the cheap kind packed in its own salty liquor with the soft bones and skin still inside. The cook would crack it open and tip it into a bowl, then go in with bare hands, crushing the little vertebrae between her fingers because those bones carried calcium and nobody wasted them. In went a beaten egg, a handful of cracker crumbs, or a spoon of cornmeal, finely diced onion, and a shake of black pepper, sometimes a little chopped bell pepper for color and snap. The mixture came together cool and slightly sticky, holding the shape of a patty when pressed between two palms. Then the skillet, a film of hot grease, the wet hiss as each cake went down, and that smell rising through the house, briny and golden, pulling sleeping children out of their beds. They fried until the edges set into a deep mahogany crust and the kitchen window fogged at the corners, grease snapping every time the cook flipped one with the back of a fork. There was a reason this dish appeared so often, and it was not only the price. Government nutrition workers had figured that a single can of salmon mixed with a little flour and one egg held enough protein to unlock the niacin buried in cornmeal and ward off pellagra for a family of 4 when eaten once a week. That made it medicine that tasted like a treat. So it became Sunday food or Saturday night into Sunday food, set out beside a mound of grits or a bowl of rice with a wedge of hot sauce on the rim of the plate. Crisp and craggy outside, moist and flaky within, the little bones gone so soft that no child ever noticed them. A nickel can of fish dressed up into something worth saying grace over. Number 18, Hoppin' John. Born in the low country rice fields, this one-pot supper carried West Africa straight to the southern table. It came from the Gullah Geechee people of coastal South Carolina, descendants of enslaved Africans who paired the rice they knew how to grow with black-eyed peas, a legume with deep African roots. Food historians trace it back to Tibo Niebe, a Senegalese rice and bean dish, and to wake from Ghana. The cooking was plain and forgiving. Black-eyed peas simmered with a piece of smoked pork until soft. Then rice went into the same pot to cook in that seasoned liquid until the grains drank it all up. One pot, 2 cheap staples, and a scrap of pork was enough to feed everyone at the table. By New Year's, the dish carried meaning too. The peas standing for coins and good luck in the year ahead. Filling, frugal, and rooted in history older than the South itself. Number 17, fried chicken livers. When a chicken was dressed for Sunday, the livers were never thrown out because they made a supper all their own. These little dark morsels came nearly free, the part most folks today never think to cook. The cook would rinse them, roll them in seasoned flour, and slide them into hot grease where they spit and crackled and crisped up fast. The outside turned crunchy and brown, while the inside stayed soft and rich. A few minutes was all they needed, and a small bowl of them went a long way. Some families served them over rice with a spoon of pan gravy. Others piled them onto a plate with hot sauce and ate them with their fingers straight from the skillet. Cheap, quick, and deeply savory, fried chicken livers turned a handful of giblets into a real meal, a reminder that nothing on the bird ever went to waste. Number 16, cornmeal mush. This was breakfast, supper, and tomorrow's lunch, all from the same humble bag of meal. The cook stirred cornmeal slowly into a pot of boiling salted water, whisking hard so it would not clump, then let it bubble and thicken into a soft porridge. Eaten hot that night with a little molasses or a pat of fat, it warmed the body straight through. But the real economy showed up the next day. Whatever mush was left got poured into a loaf pan and set aside to firm up overnight as it cooled. By morning, it had set solid enough to slice. Those slices went into a greased skillet and fried until both sides turned crisp and golden, eaten with syrup or alongside whatever meat there was. One pot, eaten 2 ways, with nothing wasted between. Corn and water turned into 2 meals by simple patience. A poor man's dish that asked for almost nothing and gave back warmth. Number 15, smothered chicken. A single tough old hen too tired to lay became a Sunday-worthy supper through the patience of smothering. This was not the crisp fried bird of the holidays. It was the everyday way to cook a cheap, stringy chicken until it surrendered. The cook browned the pieces in a heavy skillet, then deglazed the pan with a little broth or water, scraping up the dark browned bits that held all the flavor. Seasoning went in, the lid went on, and the whole thing simmered low until the meat pulled away from the bone and the liquid thickened into a deep brown gravy. A sliced onion melted into the sauce, sweetening it. By the end, one small bird had become a pot of tender meat swimming in gravy, enough to spoon over a mountain of rice and feed a full table. Served over rice or potatoes, it turned the toughest hen into comfort. Slow cooking made the cheapest chicken taste like a feast. Number 14, dirty rice. The name came from the way chopped chicken livers and gizzards speckled the white grains until the whole pot looked dirty. This was thrift cooking at its cleverest. The giblets that came tucked inside every chicken, the parts most kitchens discarded, were finely chopped and browned in a skillet with onion, celery, and bell pepper. That savory mixture got folded into cooked rice along with the pan drippings, staining the grains brown and loading them with deep, meaty flavor. A whole skillet of it cost almost nothing because the most expensive thing in it was the rice. It stretched a few cents of organ meat across a dish big enough to feed everyone, and it tasted far richer than its price. Working families across the South kept it in heavy rotation precisely because it turned scraps into something that ate like real meat, bold, savory, and proof that flavor never needed money. A full pot born from the parts other folks threw away. Number 13, smothered turkey wings. A pound of fresh turkey wings cost 19 cents at the meat counter in 1957. Most white shoppers passed the wings by because they didn't know what to do with them. Your grandmother knew exactly what to do. She washed the wings in cold water, dredged them in flour, seasoned with salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and a pinch of poultry seasoning, and browned them in a skillet of bacon grease until the skin was crisp like paper. Then the wings went into a deep pot with 2 yellow onions, 3 stalks of celery, and 4 cups of water. The lid went on. The pot simmered on the back burner for 2.5 hours. By supper time, the meat was falling off the bone and the broth had turned into a thick mahogany gravy. She served the wings over rice with the gravy ladled across both. 6 children licked their fingers clean. You'd watch the wing bones get picked over twice. Number 12, stewed pig feet. The part of the hog nobody else wanted became a supper that simmered all afternoon and fell off the bone. When a pig was butchered, the feet were among the lowliest scraps, mostly skin, bone, and connective tissue handed off cheap or for nothing at all. But black Southern cooks understood that low and slow heat would turn that tough joint into something rich. They scrubbed the feet clean, split them, and dropped them into a pot of water with an onion, a few peppercorns, and a little vinegar to cut the heaviness. Then the pot simmered for 3 or 4 hours until the connective tissue broke down into a soft, gelatinous tenderness and the meat slid away from the bone. The broth thickened on its own from all that natural gelatin. Some folks ate them straight from the pot with a splash of hot sauce. Others pickled them in vinegar to keep on the counter as a snack. Served over rice with a piece of bread to sop the broth, this dish proved the patience could feed a family on what others discarded. Tender, sticky, and gone too soon from the table. Number 11, chitterlings. No dish carried more history or more labor than a pot of cleaned hog intestines on the stove. Back in slavery times, when the hog was killed, the enslaver kept the hams and the chops, and the intestines were among the parts passed down to the quarters. The people who received them brought West African knowledge with them, where no part of an animal was ever wasted, and they made something nourishing out of what was meant as refuse. The work was punishing. Each length of intestine had to be turned inside out and scraped clean by hand, rinsed again and again until it was spotless, a job that could take the better part of a day. Then they simmered for hours with onion, garlic, and a splash of vinegar, the smell filling the whole house. By the holidays, chitlins meant family. The women gathered around the sink, cleaning together, talking and laughing through the chore. Served with hot sauce and a side of greens, they fed a crowd on the cheapest part of the pig, a dish born of survival that became a tradition worth gathering for. Number 10, hog head cheese. Out of the one part of the pig the big house refused to touch, black cooks made a cold, savory loaf that fed a family for days. Despite the name, there was no cheese in it at all. After a hog was slaughtered, the head was boiled for hours along with the feet until every scrap of meat loosened from the bone and the fat and gelatin melted into the water. The cook picked the meat clean by hand, chopped it fine, and seasoned it hard with onion, black pepper, sage, and often a good shot of vinegar for the version they called sauce. All of it went back into a loaf pan where the natural gelatin from the feet set the whole thing into a firm, sliceable jelly as it cooled overnight. The next day, it came out of the pan in one solid block, ready to be cut cold and laid on bread or eaten with crackers. Nothing from the head went to waste, not the ears, not the snout, Not a bit of it. A frugal masterpiece that turned the humblest scraps into something to slice and savor. Number 9, red beans and rice. Monday was wash day in New Orleans, and a pot of red beans could mind itself while the women scrubbed clothes all morning. The tradition was built around Sunday's leftovers. Whatever ham bone or pork bone was left from the Sunday meal went straight into the pot Monday morning, along with a bag of small red beans, an onion, celery, and bell pepper. Then it simmered low for hours, asking for nothing more than an occasional stir while the heavy work of laundry got done. By supper time, the beans had cooked down soft and creamy, the broth gone thick and savory from the bone, and it all got ladled over a bed of white rice. The dish was filling, it was cheap, and it stretched a single bone across a whole pot big enough for everyone. Generations of working families leaned on it precisely because it fed many for the price of few. Creamy beans, smoky pork, and rice that drank up every drop. A Monday institution born from making do. Number 8, collard greens and cornbread. A mess of greens cooked down with a scrap of pork and a wedge of cornbread to sop the broth made a full supper out of almost nothing. The greens themselves grew cheap in any southern garden, hardy enough to stand through frost. The cook washed them leaf by leaf to get the grit out, tore them off the tough stems, and simmered them long and slow with a piece of salt pork, fatback, or a ham hock until they went silky and dark. But the real prize was the liquid left in the bottom of the pot, the potlikker. That broth carried the iron, the vitamins, and all the flavor cooked out of the greens, and it traced straight back to slavery when cooks poured off the cooking liquid from the big house greens to feed their own families with cornbread. Crumbled cornbread dropped into a bowl of that potlikker turned 2 cheap things into a meal that stuck to the ribs: bitter greens, smoky broth, and golden bread. Poverty cooking that nourished body and soul alike. Number 7, fried fatback and gravy. When there was no other meat in the house, a slab of pure pork fat could still flavor a whole supper. Fatback was exactly what it sounds like, the hard fat cut from the back of the hog, nearly all fat with little or no lean. It was about the cheapest thing the butcher sold, and on a poor table it did the work of bacon. The cook sliced it thin and laid it in a dry skillet where it rendered down and crisped into chewy, salty strips while leaving behind a pan full of hot grease. Into that grease went a spoon of flour, browned and stirred, then a splash of milk or water until it thickened into a peppery white gravy. The fatback got eaten alongside, and the gravy went over biscuits to soak up every bit. A few cents of fat fed a family and left nothing on the plate. Crisp pork, rich gravy, and bread to catch it all. Number 6, oxtails. This was the dish that once held an entire Sunday together, simmering on the stove from morning service straight through to the evening meal. The tail of the cow was about as cheap as beef ever got, a bony, gristly cut that the better kitchens passed over without a second look. Black Southern cooks knew that very toughness was the secret. They browned the cut sections hard in a heavy pot, then covered them in water or a little broth with onion, garlic, and a bay leaf, and let the whole thing braise low for 3 or 4 hours. Hour by hour, the connective tissue melted into the liquid, thickening it into a deep, glossy gravy, while the meat grew so tender it pulled away from the bone with a fork. The longer it cooked, the richer it got, which made it the perfect pot to leave going while the family was at church. Spooned over rice with the gravy poured thick on top, it turned the cheapest beef in the store into the centerpiece of the Sunday table. Hearty, deeply savory, and worth waiting all day for. Number 5, black-eyed peas. A bag of dried peas and a scrap of pork made a pot that fed the whole table and carried good luck in the bargain. These little peas, crossed the ocean with enslaved Africans who had grown and eaten them for generations, and they took root in southern soil as one of the cheapest and most dependable suppers a poor family could set on the stove. Dried, they kept all winter in a sack. The cook covered them in water, dropped in a ham hock or a piece of salt pork, an onion, and let them simmer until the peas went soft and the broth turned smoky and thick. Some folks cooked them down with rice. Others ate them straight from the bowl with cornbread on the side to sop up the liquor. On New Year's Day, they meant prosperity. The peas, standing in for coins, eaten for luck in the year to come. Filling, frugal, and steeped in meaning. A whole pot of supper from a handful of dried peas and a bone. Number 4, fried catfish. Pulled cheap or free from the muddy bottoms of southern rivers. This fish fed many a family that could not afford to buy meat. Catfish were bottom feeders that nobody had to pay for if you owned a line and a riverbank, which made them a poor man's protein across the whole South. The cook cleaned the fish, rolled the pieces in seasoned cornmeal, and slid them into a skillet of hot grease, where the meal coating crisped into a craggy golden crust, while the flesh inside steamed up tender and flaky. Cornmeal was the key, cheap and always on hand, and it fried up crunchier than flour ever could. A squeeze of hot sauce, a piece of cornbread, or a few hush puppies fried in the same grease, and supper was on the table. Friday night fish fries grew up around this dish, the smell of it carrying down the block. Crisp outside, sweet and flaky within, caught for nothing and fried to gold. A river supper that asked only for a line and a hot skillet. Number 3, fried cabbage. A single head of cabbage and a scrap of pork could fill a whole skillet and feed everyone at the table. Cabbage was about the cheapest vegetable a family could buy, a heavy head that kept for weeks and stretched a long way once it hit the pan. The cook started a little fatback, salt pork, or bacon drippings in a heavy skillet, then piled in the shredded cabbage, which cooked down from a towering mound to a soft, glistening tangle. A lid trapped the steam and softened it, then off it came so the edges could catch and brown against the iron and turn sweet. A shake of salt and black pepper was all the seasoning it needed, the pork doing the rest of the work. Served with cornbread or a spoon of rice, it made a hearty meatless plate, or it rolled alongside whatever little meat there was. A few cents of cabbage and a scrap of fat turned into a full pan, sweet, smoky, and proof that the humblest vegetable could carry a supper. Number 2, stewed tomatoes and rice. When the garden gave more tomatoes than a family could eat fresh, this dish put up the surplus and turned it into a warm winter supper. In summer, ripe tomatoes came in faster than anyone could keep up, so the cook stewed them down with a little onion and put them up in jars to last the cold months. Come winter, a jar of those stewed tomatoes went into a pot with a spoon of fat, a little sugar to balance the tartness, and a handful of rice cooked right in the tomato liquid until it swelled up soft and red. The rice drank in all that sweet, tangy flavor, and the whole pot thickened into a comforting stick-to-the-ribs bowl. A crumble of stale bread or a heel of biscuit often went in too, so nothing was wasted. It cost next to nothing. Leaning on a vegetable, the family grew themselves in a cheap bag of rice, sweet, tangy, and warming on a cold night. A summer harvest stretched clear into the dead of winter. Number 1, cornbread and buttermilk. The humblest supper of them all was nothing more than crumbled cornbread drowned in a glass of buttermilk, eaten with a spoon. When the meat was gone, when the garden was bare, when there was truly nothing else, there was almost always cornmeal in the bin and a little soured milk in the crock. The cook baked a plain pone of cornbread, cracked it into chunks in a tall glass or a bowl, and poured cold, tangy buttermilk over the top until it softened. Then it was eaten with a spoon, the way a child might eat cereal. The tang of the buttermilk cut the plainness of the corn, and together they sat heavy enough in the stomach to carry a body to morning. It was poor folks' food in the truest sense, a last supper before the cupboard was empty, and yet old men spoke of it for the rest of their lives as the taste of home, cold, tangy, and filling for the price of nearly nothing. A bowl that fed the body when there was nothing left to give. Number 18, smothered oxtails with onion. A heavy enamel Dutch oven on a coal range in 1947, Cleveland. 4 pounds of oxtails, dredged in flour, browned on every side. They wore a dark crust. The cook poured off most of the grease, added 2 yellow onions, sliced thick, 3 cloves of garlic, a quart of beef broth from the bones the day before. She covered the pot, slid it to the back of the range, let it braise 4 hours while she did the wash. The oxtails came out fork tender. The gravy was the color of strong coffee. The onions had melted into the sauce. She served it over white rice with stewed collards and a wedge of cornbread fresh from the oven. The dish fed 6 for 35 cents in 1947. That was the whole bill. Your grandfather ate it on Sunday after church, the way his father had before him. It signaled your family had survived another week. Fried bologna with white bread was a 10-cent dinner that showed up on tables across every black neighborhood in the 1960s and 70s. Not because anyone planned it, but because the refrigerator was low and the energy was lower. A thick slice of Oscar Mayer or store-brand bologna went into a dry skillet over medium heat. Without those slits, 2 cuts like a cross, the meat would dome up in the center and burn at the edges. Done right, the bologna curled slightly, browned in spots, and developed a salty crust that no fancy charcuterie could match. Laid on soft white bread with yellow mustard or a smear of mayonnaise, it was dinner in 4 minutes. Some added a slice of American cheese, others put hot sauce on the bread first, and the old folks who ate it alone at night, they didn't need sides. Just a sandwich, a glass of sweet tea, and the television on low. Number 22, hoe cakes. The name came from field workers who cooked cornmeal batter on the flat blade of a garden hoe held over an open fire. By the 1950s, the hoe was gone, but the name stayed. Cornmeal, water, salt, a spoonful of bacon grease. You dropped the batter into a hot skillet and flattened it thin. 3 minutes per side, crispy outside, dense inside, ready for a potlikker or syrup or just eaten plain with your hands. A batch from 1 cup of cornmeal cost less than 5 cents. In the black farming communities of the Mississippi Delta, hoe cakes were the bread of the table when there was no money for flour. Enslaved people had made them for centuries. Their grandchildren still made them in the 1950s. The recipe had not changed because the recipe could not get any simpler. Cornmeal and water and heat. That was survival's whole recipe on a plate. Number 23, chicken neck stew with rice. A Memphis butcher in 1942 sold chicken necks for $0.05 a pound, sometimes gave them away on Saturday night. The case had to be empty by Monday. She bought 4 pounds, simmered them in salted water with 1 onion and 3 peppercorns for 2 hours. The meat slid off the bone, the broth ran cloudy, the rice cooked in the Potlikker, no extra water. The necks went on top to keep warm. She stripped the meat with 2 forks at the table while the children watched and learned. That was how every Memphis cook taught her daughter. The dish fed 7 for 30 cents. The Memphis paper printed it next to a war bond ad and a coupon for canned milk. In those years, nobody threw away the necks. By 1968, the supermarket sold whole chickens, cheap enough that nobody bothered. The butcher case stopped stocking them around 1974. Year after year, the cut got harder to find. You can't even ask for them today. When the grocery money ran out 3 days before the check came, eggs and rice with tomato gravy kept the lights on inside the body. This was Depression-era arithmetic carried through generations of black kitchens. A dozen eggs for 30 cents in the 1940s, a cup of rice from a bulk sack, and a can of tomatoes that stretched across 2 meals. Rice cooked plain, eggs scrambled soft in a skillet with butter or bacon grease, pulled off the heat while still wet so they wouldn't turn rubbery. The tomato gravy came together in the same pan. Canned tomatoes crushed by hand, a little sugar to cut the acid, salt, and a spoonful of flour to thicken it. Everything went into one bowl. Eggs on rice, gravy over both. And for a few minutes, the kitchen smelled like someone was taking care of you, even if that someone was yourself. The old ones could tell by the color of the gravy whether it had been made with love or just made to get through. Nobody talked about this one at the family reunion, but everyone knew. Number 23, rice and gravy. In the low country of South Carolina and the Creole kitchens of Louisiana, rice was not a side dish, it was the foundation. Leftover rice went back into the pot the next evening with a ladle of brown gravy saved from the night before. Gravy from smothered pork chops. Gravy from stewed chicken necks. Gravy from pan drippings collected in a jar by the stove. You heated it until the rice absorbed every drop and each grain was coated in something rich and dark. In the Gula communities of the Sea Islands, rice and gravy for supper was so traditional that not having it felt wrong. The rice was always there because no one in a Gula kitchen ever cooked less than a full pot. A 5-pound bag of rice cost 49 cents in 1955 and lasted 2 weeks. The gravy was free because it had already been paid for with yesterday's supper. Nothing wasted, nothing thrown away. Number 17, fried bologna and biscuit sandwich. A round of red rind bologna on the butcher counter in 1944 Pittsburgh, 20 cents a pound. The War Ration Board rewrote the rules every other Tuesday. She cut 4 thick slices, scored each one with an X to keep it from puffing, laid them in a hot iron skillet with a teaspoon of bacon grease. The edges curled into little cups that held the grease. The centers turned the color of a warm brick. The biscuits were buttermilk, baked that morning in the same skillet. She split them, laid the fried slice on the bottom half, pressed the top down so the grease soaked through. A coal miner ate 2 for breakfast and a third in his lunch pail wrapped in waxed paper. That was breakfast. The sandwich cost 5 cents in 1944. Your grandfather carried one like it into the coal seam every morning. It was the shift food of every miner from Pittsburgh to Beckley. The dish disappeared by 1980 when the bologna lost its red rind. Fried corn in a skillet started in the garden and ended on a plate still steaming. Fresh corn was cut from the cob with a sharp knife, the blade scraping afterward to release the milky starch that made it creamy without cream. In winter, canned corn worked, drained and dried so it wouldn't spatter. Into the skillet with butter or bacon grease, salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar to pull the sweetness forward. 3 or 4 minutes until the edges brown and caramelized, sugars turning golden, butter going nutty, the kitchen filling with a smell sweet enough to make you forget you were eating alone. For black seniors in the rural South, fried corn was often the entire meal, a skillet's worth, maybe with bread, eaten at a table set for one. Number 21, salt pork and gravy. Salt pork was the cheapest cut at the butcher counter, a slab of cured pork belly, mostly fat with a thin ribbon of meat running through. You sliced it thin and fried it in a skillet until the fat rendered and the edges turned crispy. Then you pulled the meat out, sprinkled flour into the drippings, stirred until golden, and poured in milk to make a thick white gravy. That gravy went over rice, over biscuits, over whatever was on the plate. The salt pork itself was almost a garnish. The gravy was the real meal. In 1954, salt pork cost 29 cents a pound. A pound made gravy for a week. Black families in the rural South ate salt pork gravy the way other Americans ate butter. It went on everything. It stretched everything. It turned a plate of plain rice into supper. The taste was salt and smoke and richness. Not meat, not really, but it disguised how little actual meat was involved. Number 22, pig feet jelly with hot vinegar. A glass mason jar on the back porch shelf in 1945 Charleston, packed with split pig feet, water, salt, bay leaf, and 3 cloves of garlic. She simmered the feet for 6 hours. The meat fell off. The broth turned the color of weak tea. She strained it, pressed the meat into the jar, let the natural collagen do the work. By morning, the whole thing had set into a pale amber jelly. She sliced it cold for supper, served it with hot pepper vinegar in a thin saucer, a stack of saltine crackers on the side. A man came in from the field, ate half the jar, asked for more. The dish needed no icebox in winter. Your grandmother could feed a working man on what the white grocer threw away. That was the genius of her Depression kitchen. You wouldn't think a foot could become supper, but it could. Grits with butter was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what you served alongside. Proof that the simplest dishes often provided the deepest comfort. Stone ground or regular grits were cooked slowly with water or milk, stirred frequently to prevent lumps until they reached a creamy consistency that held its shape on a spoon. A generous pat of butter stirred in at the end added richness that transformed humble corn into something almost luxurious. For seniors on fixed incomes, grits cost pennies per serving and satisfied hunger for hours. They could be dressed up with cheese, topped with eggs, or served alongside fish, sausage, or vegetables. The dish required patience but little active work, and the reward was a bowl full of warmth that connected you to generations of Southern tables where grits was simply a part of life. The butter hit the hot iron first, then the corn, and the sizzle told you everything about how the next 5 minutes would go. Number 24, buttermilk and cornbread. A bowl, a piece of cold cornbread left from yesterday, a glass of buttermilk poured over the top. You crumbled the cornbread into the buttermilk with your fingers the way your grandmother did and her grandmother before that, and ate it with a spoon. The cornbread softened in the tangy liquid and became something between cereal and bread pudding. Cold, sharp filling. No stove required, no heat, no effort beyond lifting a spoon. Generation after generation, the same bowl, the same spoon. Buttermilk cost 20 cents a quart in the 1950s. Cornbread was already on the counter because cornbread was always on the counter. In Black households, from the Delta to the Piedmont, this was not a recipe anyone invented. It evolved across generations, passed from hand to hand. When a grandmother in Alabama crumbled cornbread into buttermilk, she was doing what her mother did in the same kitchen with the same bowl. The meal was not about flavor, it was about continuity. Number 24, hoe cakes with sorghum molasses, a black iron griddle on a kerosene stove in 1944 Tuskegee. Smoking hot, bacon grease pooled in the center. The batter was cornmeal, salt, hot water, nothing else. She dropped it by spoonful, 3 at a time, waited for the edges to lace, flipped each round. Each cake came off the size of a saucer. Crisp brown skirt, soft yellow heart. The sorghum sat in a tin pitcher on the table, slow and dark as tar. A child got 2 and was full. A working man got 6 and was satisfied. Your grandmother made these the way her mother had during the Depression. A sack of cornmeal lasted you a family 2 weeks. The supper cost 8 cents in 1944. By 1965, the kerosene stove was gone. The hoe cake went with it. You won't find it on any menu now. Tomato sandwiches with mayonnaise only appeared when the garden came in. That short window in July and August when the tomatoes were heavy, warm from the vine, and red all the way through. This was never a winter meal. The tomato had to be sliced thick, almost a 1/4 inch, laid on soft white bread, spread with Duke's mayonnaise. Always Duke's in the South, where brand loyalty ran deeper than politics. Salt and black pepper on top, nothing else. The bread soaked through from the juice within seconds, and you ate it fast, leaning over the plate so it didn't drip down your wrist. For seniors who still kept a small garden or had a neighbor who brought tomatoes by, this sandwich was the taste of summer itself. No cooking, no heat from the stove, and a sweetness from the fruit that made the meal feel like a gift. Once the season passed, it was gone, and waiting for it to come back was part of what made it matter. A half pound of ground beef could become a full dinner if you knew what to do with the grease left behind. Hamburger steak and onion gravy stretched cheap meat into something that smelled like a Sunday kitchen on a Wednesday night. Number 25, scrambled eggs stretched with bread. In a kitchen where 6 children needed supper and the icebox held 4 eggs. A mother in Greenville, South Carolina, tore day-old bread into small pieces, soaked them in a splash of milk, then scrambled everything together with the eggs and bacon grease until the bread disappeared into the curds. The plate looked full. The children did not know half of what they were eating was bread. A loaf cost 14 cents in 1952. Eggs was 60 cents a dozen, 5 cents per egg stretched across 6 plates with 10 cents worth of bread. That was the math. That was every night. Mothers across the South did not have cookbooks for this. They had instincts sharpened by decades of making something look like enough when it was not. A child went to bed thinking they had eaten eggs. The mother knew the truth, but the child was full, and that was the only arithmetic that mattered. Number 16, liver and gravy over rice. A pound of beef liver on the butcher's paper in 1945 New Orleans. Deep purple, dressed in flour. She sliced it thin, dredged each piece, seared it in bacon drippings 2 minutes aside. The outside browned, the inside stayed pink. The liver came out, 3 sliced onions went in, sweated soft, caramel color. The kitchen smelled sweet enough to bring the children in from the yard. She made the gravy in the same pan with the fawn, a tablespoon of flour, and a cup of water from the rice pot. The whole supper went over a plate of long grain Carolina rice. It cost 12 cents and fed 4. Your grandmother served it once a week the way her mother had during the Depression. Liver was a Wednesday staple in every working kitchen. By 1973, liver had become a punishment children whispered about on the school bus. The dish vanished. Vienna sausages, straight from the tin, were the dinner that happened when dinner didn't happen. When the legs were tired, the stove felt too far, and the body just needed something before bed. The small can popped open with a pull tab, and the pale little sausages sat in their broth like something between a meal and an apology. Eaten cold with saltines and a squirt of yellow mustard, or picked up with fingers one at a time, this was a dinner measured in silence. It cost 35 cents in the 1970s. It required nothing, no cooking, no plates if you didn't want one, no effort beyond pulling the tab. For seniors living alone in small apartments after their families moved away, this was Tuesday night and Wednesday and sometimes Friday. Nobody judged it out loud because everyone had a can in the cabinet. The people who ate Vienna sausages for dinner weren't ashamed. They were tired, and tired is its own kind of hungry. Now, here is the challenge. Pick just one of these suppers and cook it this coming week, slow and from scratch, then sit down at the table to eat it instead of in front of the screen. Drop a comment and tell everyone which one you chose and whether anybody in your family ever made it. It would be something to see whether folks reach for the red beans and rice or the hog head cheese our grandmothers kept on the stove, because none of these meals were ever really about being poor. They were about love stretched thin and made to go around, about hands that refused to let anybody at our table go hungry. Cook one and you keep that table set a little longer.